You know what the difference is between people like you and people like me? Billionaire Richard Whitmore said with a slow grin as crystal chandeliers shimmered above the ballroom. Dreams cost you everything. For me, they're entertainment. The laughter came instantly. Low at first, then louder, rolling across the grand dining hall of the Whitmore Automotive Gala in downtown Detroit like expensive thunder. Waiters carrying silver trays slowed their steps. Women in black gowns exchanged amused glances over champagne glasses. Somewhere near the stage, a jazz piano continued playing softly, elegant and cold. Vivian Cole stood perfectly still beside table 14, one hand wrapped around a tray of sparkling water, the other stained faintly with motor oil she had failed to scrub completely from beneath her fingernails before work. She was used to people noticing the stain. She was not used to an entire ballroom staring at her at once. Richard leaned back in his chair, expensive cufflinks catching the warm amber light. "Say it again," he said, clearly entertained now. "You build engines where?" A few guests chuckled before she even answered. Vivian lifted her chin calmly. "In my father's garage on Jefferson Avenue." Another wave of laughter crashed through the room. Someone near the bar whispered, "No way." Another man smirked into his bourbon. Richard shook his head slowly as though he had just heard the most charming joke of the year. "A garage," he repeated. "That tiny little place next to the old tire shop?" He laughed harder now, glancing around at the investors seated beside him. "That's not a business, sweetheart. That's a hobby with a leaking roof." More laughter. But Vivian did not move. She didn't look embarrassed. She didn't shrink. That was the first thing Richard noticed. Most people lowered their eyes around powerful men. Most people tried to escape humiliation before it burned too deeply. But Vivian simply stood there beneath the chandelier light, her dark brown eyes steady and unreadable. Across the ballroom, servers avoided looking at her directly. They knew this feeling. The feeling of becoming invisible and exposed at the exact same time. Richard picked up the small silver model engine displayed beside his wine glass. "You know what this prototype cost me?" he asked casually. $3 million and 2 engineering teams from Zurich. He spun the polished piece between his fingers. "And you think you can compete with that from a little garage?" Vivian finally set the tray down carefully onto a nearby table. The soft clink of glass somehow silenced the room more effectively than shouting ever could. Even the piano player slowed uncertainly. She stepped closer to the billionaire's table, not enough to challenge him physically, but enough for every guest to feel the tension shift. "No," she said quietly. "I think I can build something better." A few people gasped softly. Richard blinked once in surprise before laughing again, this time sharper. "Confidence," he said. "I'll give you that." He motioned toward the ballroom around them. "Look around, Miss Cole. These people built industries. They own factories, shipping ports, steel contracts. You're serving drinks." Vivian nodded once. "Tonight, yes." Richard smirked. "And tomorrow?" The room held its breath. Vivian looked directly at him, calm as midnight oil beneath factory lights. 90 days from now," she said softly, "you'll remember my name." Silence spread across the ballroom, so suddenly the sound of ice settling inside crystal glasses became audible. Richard's smile remained on his face, but something behind his eyes shifted slightly, almost imperceptibly. Vivian picked up her tray again and walked away through the sea of tuxedos and diamonds, while whispers followed behind her like sparks drifting from steel. None of them noticed the older mechanic standing near the kitchen entrance staring at her with quiet disbelief, because he had seen the blueprints hidden inside that tiny garage on Jefferson Avenue. And he knew Vivian Cole was not bluffing. The garage smelled like rain, burnt metal, and old memories. Vivian pushed the rusted side door open just after midnight, and the weak yellow bulb hanging from the ceiling flickered twice before finally staying alive. Outside, Jefferson Avenue was quiet except for the distant sound of freight trains rolling through Detroit's industrial district. Inside the garage, time had never fully moved on. Her father's old denim jacket still hung beside the workbench. Coffee stains darkened the cracked drafting table near the wall. Shelves overflowed with bolts, gears, worn-out carburetors, and engine parts collected over 20 years. Most people would have called it junk. Vivian called it inheritance. She slowly removed the black waitress apron from around her waist and tossed it onto a folding chair beside the toolbox. Then she walked toward the center table where dozens of blueprints were spread beneath a heavy glass paperweight. The edges were yellow with age. Handwritten calculations covered the margins in faded ink. Some pages still carried grease marks from her father's hands. Benjamin Cole had spent almost 15 years designing an energy-efficient combustion system that nobody believed could work. He used to come home exhausted from Whitmore Steel every night, smelling like machine oil and factory smoke, only to stay awake until 2 in the morning sketching ideas beneath this exact light bulb. Vivian could still hear his voice sometimes. The big companies do not want efficient machines, he once told her while tightening a loose valve on an old engine block. They want machines people depend on forever. She was only 12 then, sitting cross-legged on the concrete floor while eating microwaved macaroni from a paper bowl. Back then, she thought her father sounded paranoid. Years later, after watching him lose everything, she realized he had simply been honest. Vivian ran her fingers slowly across one of the blueprints. At the top corner, written carefully in black ink, were the words, Cole Thermal System, Prototype 7. Her chest tightened slightly. Prototype 7 was the last design her father touched before Whitmore Steel terminated his contract. Officially, the company claimed budget cuts. Unofficially, Benjamin Cole had accused senior executives of suppressing his research because it threatened several profitable supplier contracts. Nobody listened. A year later, he died from a heart condition before ever seeing his work completed. The city forgot him. Quickly. Bills did not. Vivian crossed the garage and turned on a small portable heater near the workbench. The old machine rattled loudly before coughing warm air into the cold room. Snow tapped softly against the garage windows now. Detroit winters always felt colder in industrial neighborhoods. She grabbed a flashlight and crouched beside the partially assembled engine resting near the hydraulic lift. It was smaller than traditional commercial systems, cleaner, lighter, and almost unnaturally compact. Her father's design had always been about efficiency instead of size. Vivian tightened one of the fuel intake bolts carefully, then paused when she heard footsteps outside. A shadow appeared briefly beneath the garage door before a familiar voice called out softly, "Vivian? You still awake?" She recognized old Mr. Dawson instantly. The retired mechanic from 2 blocks away stepped inside carrying a white paper bag that smelled like fresh coffee and cinnamon rolls. His gray beard was dusted with snowflakes. He looked toward the engine and shook his head slowly. "You know half this city thinks you embarrassed yourself tonight," he said gently. Vivian wiped grease from her hands with a cloth rag. "Maybe." Mr. Dawson studied her face for a moment. "And the other half?" A slow smile appeared across Vivian's face as she looked toward her father's blueprints beneath the flickering light. "The other half," she said quietly, "has not seen this engine run yet." By sunrise the next morning, the video from the gala had already spread across half of Detroit's business circles. Vivian heard the whispers before she even clocked into work. 2 valet attendants near the restaurant entrance stopped talking when she walked past them. A woman in a white fur coat glanced at her phone screen, then looked directly at Vivian with open amusement before entering the building. Even inside the kitchen, cooks were replaying the clip between breakfast orders. Richard Whitmore's laughter echoed from tiny phone speakers over and over again. A hobby with a leaking roof. Every time the line played, someone smirked. Vivian kept working anyway. She tied her apron tightly, balanced 3 coffee mugs onto a tray, and moved between tables with quiet focus while snow drifted softly outside the restaurant windows. Downtown Detroit looked polished from inside expensive restaurants. Outside, gray slush covered the sidewalks, and factory smoke blurred the winter sky. Around 11 in the morning, the manager called her toward the front office. "Vivian," he said carefully, avoiding direct eye contact, "there is somebody here asking for you." She frowned slightly. Nobody ever came looking for her at work. When she stepped into the lobby, she found a young white man leaning against the wall beside the coat rack. He looked no older than 22, dressed in a dark wool coat and clean sneakers that probably cost more than her monthly electric bill. His blonde hair was messy in a deliberate way wealthy people somehow managed to make fashionable. He lowered his phone immediately when he saw her. "You are Vivian Cole?" he asked. Vivian nodded cautiously. Who are you? The young man extended his hand. Ethan Whitmore. Her expression changed instantly. Whitmore. Of course. The resemblance around the eyes made sense now. Ethan gave an awkward half-smile as though he had seen her reaction coming. Before you throw me out, he said quickly, I am not here to defend my father. Vivian crossed her arms. Then why are you here? Ethan glanced around the quiet lobby before lowering his voice slightly. Because I watched that video 6 times last night. Vivian said nothing. Ethan pulled a folded printout from inside his coat pocket and carefully handed it to her. She unfolded the paper slowly. Her heartbeat nearly stopped. It was one of her old engineering forum posts from 3 years ago. A thermal efficiency diagram she had uploaded anonymously at 2 in the morning, while experimenting with airflow calculations. You posted this under the username MotorCityV, Ethan said. Right. Vivian looked up sharply. How did you find that? Ethan shrugged lightly. Because I study mechanical engineering at Michigan State, and this design has been floating around online engineering forums for years. Most people ignored it because the account disappeared. He paused. But I did. Not. Vivian stared at him silently now. Ethan continued carefully. Your airflow ratio is insane. If the compression calculations are real, your engine could reduce commercial fuel consumption by almost 40%. The words landed heavily between them. For the first time since the gala, someone was speaking to her like an engineer instead of a joke. Ethan glanced toward the snow-covered street outside. My father thinks innovation only happens inside billion-dollar facilities, he said quietly. But honestly, some of the smartest ideas I have ever seen came from people nobody took seriously. Vivian folded the paper slowly. Why are you helping me? Ethan laughed softly. Because watching my father underestimate people is becoming a family tradition I am getting tired of. For the first time all morning, the corner of Vivian's mouth lifted slightly. Ethan reached into his coat pocket again and slid a small keycard across the counter toward her. There is an industrial supply warehouse near 8 Mile Road, he said. One of my friends manages inventory there overnight. Damaged materials get discarded every week. Aluminum casings. Test tubing. Cooling valves. Vivian looked at the keycard carefully. You are serious? Ethan nodded once. Very. Then his expression shifted slightly more serious. But if you are going to prove him wrong, Vivian. He glanced toward the viral video still playing silently on the television above the restaurant bar. You are going to need that engine running fast. 3 weeks later, the garage no longer sounded empty. Air compressors hissed constantly. Metal clanged against concrete floors. Cooling fans rattled near the workbench while old speakers hanging beside the tool cabinet played soft jazz through static-filled radio channels. Vivian barely slept anymore. Some nights she worked until 4 in the morning before changing clothes in the tiny restroom behind the garage and heading directly to the restaurant for breakfast shifts. The skin beneath her eyes darkened from exhaustion, but the engine was finally beginning to breathe the way her father once imagined. Snowstorms had turned into freezing rain across Detroit now. Water dripped steadily through a crack in the garage, sealing into a rusty bucket near the hydraulic lift. Vivian ignored it while tightening another fuel pressure line beneath the prototype casing. Ethan stood nearby holding a flashlight while reading airflow numbers from a laptop balanced on an overturned milk crate. Pressure ratio is stable, he said carefully. At least for now. Vivian slid out from beneath the engine and wiped sweat from her forehead with the sleeve of her gray hoodie. That is the first good sentence I have heard all week. Ethan laughed softly. You know most people with your intelligence would have tried raising venture capital by now. Vivian walked toward the workbench where her father's blueprints remained spread open beneath scattered tools and coffee cups. Most people did not watch their father lose everything after trusting executives in expensive suits. Ethan nodded quietly. He understood more than she realized. Over the last few weeks he had started noticing things inside Whitmore Steel that bothered him. Engineers leaving unexpectedly. Old project files disappearing from archives. Certain executives growing visibly nervous whenever his father discussed fuel efficiency research during board meetings. Something inside the company felt hidden beneath layers of polished corporate language. But tonight none of that mattered yet. Tonight was supposed to be proof. Vivian adjusted the final calibration valve, while Mr. Dawson rolled open the garage door halfway to help clear ventilation. Cold Michigan air swept into the building, carrying the smell of rain and wet pavement. Across the street, headlights slowed as passing drivers noticed the glowing workshop still alive after midnight. Ethan checked the laptop again. Ready. Vivian stared at the engine silently for 2 full seconds. Her father's handwriting covered the nearby blueprints like ghostly fingerprints guiding her every movement. Finally she nodded once. Start fuel intake. Ethan flipped the switch carefully. A low hum filled the garage. The engine vibrated slightly. Fuel pressure climbed slowly across the monitor screen. Vivian stepped closer, listening carefully. Every mechanic learns engines like musicians learn instruments. Rhythm mattered. Breathing mattered. Sound mattered. For one beautiful moment the machine sounded perfect. Ethan's eyes widened. Vivian. The hum deepened into a powerful steady rhythm unlike anything they had heard before. The temperature gauge stabilized. Fuel consumption numbers dropped lower and lower. Mr. Dawson stared openly now. Lord have mercy, he whispered. Vivian could barely breathe. Her father's design was working. Then suddenly the pressure monitor flashed red. Ethan's expression changed instantly. Wait. Vivian rushed toward the control panel. The coolant line is overheating. A sharp metallic screech exploded through the garage. Steam burst violently from beneath the engine casing, flooding the room in thick white smoke. Ethan stumbled backward, coughing while alarms screamed across the monitor screen. Vivian grabbed the emergency shutoff lever immediately, but the engine jerked violently before a loud cracking sound echoed through the building. Sparks showered onto the concrete floor. Then silence. Complete silence. Steam drifted slowly upward beneath the flickering garage light. Rain tapped softly outside. Nobody moved for several seconds. Vivian stared at the damaged engine as coolant leaked steadily across the floor beneath it. Her hands trembled slightly. Ethan looked toward the destroyed pressure chamber and swallowed hard. The thermal seal collapsed, he said quietly. Mr. Dawson removed his cap slowly. How bad? Ethan hesitated before answering. Bad enough that if this happened during a live investor demo. He did not finish the sentence. He did not need to. Vivian walked slowly toward the workbench and picked up one of her father's old blueprints with grease-covered fingers. The edges shook slightly in her hands now. Outside, thunder rolled across Detroit's skyline while cold rain hammered against the leaking garage roof. And for the first time since the gala, doubt finally entered the room. The next morning, the garage felt colder than usual. Rainwater still dripped steadily into the metal bucket near the wall, each hollow ping echoing through the silence like a clock counting down the little time Vivian had left. The damaged engine sat motionless beneath the hanging light bulb, half covered with smoke stains and coolant residue. Vivian had not gone home. She had not even changed clothes. She sat alone at the drafting table wrapped in her father's old denim jacket, staring at the collapsed thermal chamber while dawn slowly turned Detroit's gray skyline pale blue outside the garage windows. Across the city, people were already talking again. Another video had started spreading online overnight. Someone nearby had recorded the failed engine test through the open garage door and uploaded it with dramatic music and laughing captions. Waitress inventor blows up dream machine. 90 days looking real short. The comments multiplied by the hour. Ethan stood in the corner scrolling through his phone with growing frustration. People are brutal, he muttered quietly. Vivian barely looked up. People like watching confidence fail. Ethan lowered the phone slowly. This does not mean the design failed. Vivian gave a tired smile without humor. Tell the internet that. Mr. Dawson arrived carrying coffee around 7 in the morning, but even he looked uncertain now. He placed the paper cups carefully beside the blueprints and studied the damaged engine. You still have time, he said gently. Vivian rubbed her eyes slowly. 34 days is not time in engineering. The heater rattled loudly in the corner while cold air slipped through cracks in the garage walls. For several long minutes nobody spoke. Then Vivian finally stood and walked toward the workbench where dozens of old notebooks remained stacked beneath loose machine parts. She began flipping through pages rapidly, searching calculations, pressure ratios, thermal expansion notes. Every few seconds she stopped to compare one page against another. Ethan watched carefully. What are you looking for? Vivian did not answer immediately. Her fingers suddenly froze on a page near the center of an old black notebook stained with motor oil. Her heartbeat quickened. "No way," she whispered. Ethan stepped closer. "What?" Vivian turned the notebook toward him. Across the page, her father had written a single sentence in thick black ink years earlier. "If seal failure occurs, the chamber is not too weak. It is too efficient." Ethan frowned slightly while reading the attached calculations underneath. Then his eyes widened. "Wait." Vivian grabbed another blueprint and spread it across the table beside the notebook. "The pressure was never the real problem," she said quickly now, energy returning to her voice for the first time since the explosion. "The combustion cycle generated more retained heat than the chamber could release fast enough." Ethan stared at the numbers. "Meaning the engine was actually outperforming expectations." Vivian nodded rapidly. "Dad designed the airflow for standard industrial cooling systems because that was all Whitmore Steel could manufacture back then." She looked toward the damaged prototype with new understanding burning in her eyes now. "But modern cooling materials are lighter, faster, stronger." Mr. Dawson slowly removed his glasses. "You are saying the engine did not fail because it was weak?" Vivian looked directly at him. "It failed because it worked too well." Silence filled the garage again, but this time it felt different. Alive. Ethan suddenly laughed under his breath. "Your father was 20 years ahead of everybody." Vivian turned toward the engine slowly. Outside, weak winter sunlight finally pushed through the clouds, spilling pale gold across the garage floor and touching the damaged prototype for the first time all morning. For weeks the machine had looked like a burden. Now it looked like proof. Vivian walked toward the engine and rested one grease-stained hand against the metal casing. Her reflection shimmered faintly across the scratched surface. "Then we build a new chamber," she said quietly. Ethan smiled. "With what money?" Vivian stared at the engine for one long moment before answering. "We do not need money yet." She looked toward the old shelves filled with spare materials and unfinished parts collected over decades inside the garage. Then she smiled slightly. "We just need the right person to believe this thing can run." 2 nights later, the garage lights were still glowing long after midnight. When an 18-wheeler rolled slowly onto Jefferson Avenue, the massive truck stopped beside the curb with a loud hiss of air brakes, shaking the loose windows inside nearby buildings. Vivian looked up from the engine immediately. Ethan glanced toward the open garage door. "Who is that?" The driver climbed down from the cab wearing a faded Detroit Lions jacket and heavy work boots covered in road salt. He was tall, broad-shouldered, somewhere in his late 50s, with tired eyes that looked like they had spent decades watching highways disappear beneath headlights. "You Vivian Cole?" he asked while stepping inside the garage. Vivian nodded cautiously. "Depends who is asking." The man smiled slightly and removed his gloves. "Name is Leonard Briggs. I haul freight between Michigan, Ohio, and Pennsylvania 6 days a week." He looked directly toward the prototype engine resting beneath the work lights. "And apparently the internet thinks you are either a genius or completely insane." Ethan laughed quietly under his breath. Leonard pulled out his phone and held up a trucking forum filled with screenshots of Vivian's failed test video. "Truck drivers have been arguing about you for 48 hours, he said. "Most think this whole thing is fake." Vivian crossed her arms. "And you?" Leonard shrugged. "I think real engineers look exhausted." For the first time all evening Vivian smiled. Leonard slowly walked around the prototype, studying the rebuilt chamber carefully while cold winter air drifted through the open garage door. "You really think this thing saves fuel?" he asked. Vivian looked toward the engine confidently now. "I know it does." Leonard nodded once. "Then prove it." Silence settled over the garage. Ethan looked between them carefully. "You are serious?" Leonard reached into his pocket and tossed a set of truck keys onto the workbench. "Tomorrow morning I am hauling refrigeration equipment to Cleveland. 420 miles round trip." He pointed toward the engine. "If your system works, put it in my backup rig." Vivian's heartbeat quickened instantly. A real highway test. Not simulations. Not calculations. Reality. Ethan stepped closer. Carefully. "Leonard, if something fails on the road," Leonard interrupted him calmly. "Kid, I have driven trucks since Ronald Reagan was president. I know the difference between dangerous and experimental. He looked directly at Vivian again. Question is, do you trust your own machine? The garage suddenly felt silent except for the ticking sound of cooling metal near the workbench. Vivian stared at the truck keys for several long seconds before picking them up slowly. Give me until sunrise, she said quietly. By 4:30 the next morning, snow was falling lightly across Detroit again. The prototype had been installed into Leonard's older diesel truck, while steam rose from coffee cups scattered around the garage floor. Vivian tightened the final mounting bolt beneath the hood, while Ethan monitored the fuel calibration system from his laptop. Mr. Dawson stood nearby watching nervously beneath the yellow glow of the hanging shop lights. Leonard climbed into the driver's seat and rolled down the window. Last chance to back out, he called. Vivian stepped away from the truck slowly, grease covering both hands now. Start it. Leonard turned the ignition key. For one terrifying second nothing happened. Then the engine came alive with a deep controlled rumble unlike the rough vibration typical diesel trucks usually carried. Ethan looked down at the monitor immediately. His eyes widened. Fuel efficiency already dropped 12% at idle. Leonard stared forward in disbelief while gripping the steering wheel. This thing sounds smooth. Vivian said nothing. She simply watched the truck carefully as snowflakes drifted across the headlights. Leonard finally shifted into gear. Guess we find out. The truck rolled slowly out of the garage and disappeared down Jefferson Avenue beneath the pale blue glow of early morning. For the next 14 hours, nobody inside the garage could focus on anything else. Vivian paced constantly between the workbench and the garage windows while Ethan refreshed fuel data, remotely every few minutes. The numbers looked almost impossible. By sunset, Leonard's truck crossed back into Detroit. The moment the headlights turned onto Jefferson Avenue again, Vivian ran outside into the freezing air. The truck stopped hard beside the curb. Leonard climbed down slowly without speaking. His face looked stunned. Vivian's chest tightened instantly. What happened? Leonard stared at her for one long moment before holding up a fuel receipt beneath the falling snow. I spent $187 less than normal, he said quietly. Ethan froze. Mr. Dawson removed his glasses slowly. Leonard looked back toward the humming truck engine with disbelief still written across his face. Young lady, he said softly, do you understand what trucking companies would do for numbers like that? By Monday morning, the trucking video had spread across the country. Leonard Briggs had posted a shaky cell phone recording from inside his cab showing fuel numbers updating mile after mile, while snow-covered highways rolled past the windshield. His voice sounded almost emotional in the clip. I have been driving freight for 32 years, he said into the camera, and I have never seen anything like this. The internet exploded. Independent truckers flooded forums demanding details about the engine. Logistics companies started calling Leonard nonstop asking where the test happened. News channels replayed clips from the original gala beside footage of Vivian standing inside the leaking garage covered in grease and exhaustion. Overnight, the story had changed. She was no longer the waitress people laughed at. She was becoming a problem the industry could not ignore. Inside Whitmore Steel headquarters, Richard Whitmore watched the coverage silently from the massive television mounted inside his office. Rain streaked against the 43rd floor windows overlooking downtown Detroit, while financial analysts on television discussed fuel disruption across the transportation industry. One anchor held up a printed screenshot of Vivian's old engineering diagrams. If these numbers are verified, the reporter said carefully, this technology could completely reshape commercial freight costs nationwide. Richard muted the television slowly. His expression remained calm, but the silence inside the office felt heavier now. Across the conference table, 3 executives shifted uncomfortably. One of them finally cleared his throat. It is probably temporary hype, the man said quickly. Internet attention moves fast. Richard looked toward him coldly. Does internet hype usually reduce fuel expenses by 38%? Nobody answered. Richard stood and walked slowly toward the giant office windows overlooking the city below. Somewhere down there, inside a tiny garage he once mocked publicly, a woman was suddenly shaking an entire industry with scraps of metal and an idea everybody else overlooked. Behind him, another executive adjusted his tie nervously. There is something else, sir. Richard turned slightly. What? The man slid a thick folder across the table. We started reviewing archived engineering records after the trucking test went viral. Richard frowned slightly while opening the file. The moment he saw the name Benjamin Cole printed across multiple engineering reports, something inside him tightened unexpectedly. Old project proposals, thermal efficiency concepts, combustion redesign calculations, dates stretching back more than 20 years. Richard flipped pages faster now. Then he stopped completely. One diagram looked painfully familiar. His jaw tightened. This? The executive swallowed carefully. Sir, several elements inside Vivian Cole's current prototype appear extremely similar to research proposals submitted by her father during his employment here. Richard looked up sharply. You are telling me Whitmore Steele already had access to this design? Nobody spoke for 2 full seconds. Then another executive answered quietly. Not officially. The room suddenly felt smaller. Richard flipped deeper into the file until he reached a final page marked Internal Rejection Summary. At the bottom sat a signature belonging to former executive chairman Harold Whitmore, Richard's late father. Beneath the signature, one sentence had been typed clearly across the page. Project terminated due to threat against existing supplier relationships. Richard stared at the words silently. Supplier relationships. Profits. Contracts. Suddenly memories returned with uncomfortable clarity. His father dismissing fuel efficiency research during meetings. Older engineers disappearing from projects unexpectedly. Executives quietly protecting outdated manufacturing systems because change threatened billions of dollars. Richard slowly lowered the file. Outside, thunder rolled faintly above Detroit. Does Vivian know? He asked quietly. We do not think so, the executive replied. Richard looked back toward the television screen where footage now showed Vivian speaking briefly beside Leonard's truck, while reporters crowded around the garage entrance. She looked exhausted, cold, determined, and for the first time since meeting her, Richard no longer saw a dreamer trying to impress the world. He saw someone carrying a stolen future without realizing it. His reflection stared back at him from the dark office windows now. Powerful, wealthy, respected. Yet beneath all of it, an uncomfortable truth had finally entered the room. Whitmore Steele had not ignored Benjamin Cole because his ideas failed. They ignored him because his ideas threatened people already making money. Richard loosened his tie slowly while the storm darkened the skyline outside. And somewhere deep inside the towering building carrying his family name, guilt finally began to replace arrogance. 48 hours later, reporters completely surrounded Jefferson Avenue. Satellite vans lined the street beside old repair shops while camera crews stood in freezing wind waiting for another glimpse of Vivian Cole's engine. Local truck drivers parked nearby just to shake her hand. Some brought coffee. Others brought spare parts. One older mechanic drove 3 hours from Indiana carrying custom cooling components he said she could use for the future of American trucking. The garage that once looked forgotten now looked alive. But inside Whitmore Steele headquarters, panic had already begun spreading through the executive floors. Company stock dropped almost 11% in 2 trading days after several logistics firms publicly announced they were investigating alternative fuel technologies. Financial channels debated whether Whitmore Steele had fallen behind modern innovation. Analysts questioned Richard Whitmore's leadership openly for the first time in years. Inside the boardroom on the 43rd floor, tension hung heavier than the storm clouds gathering over Detroit Harbor. We need damage control immediately, one board member snapped while tossing a financial report onto the conference table. Every major freight company is calling about this woman. Another executive leaned forward sharply. Then buy her out before somebody else does. Richard remained silent at the head of the table, while city lights flickered beyond the giant windows behind him. He had barely slept since discovering the truth about Benjamin Cole's rejected research. The deeper internal investigators searched through old records, the uglier the story became. Engineering reports buried. Contracts protected. Supplier deals prioritized over innovation. And now the daughter of the man they ignored was becoming the face of the very future they once buried. Richard, another board member said carefully, you need to make a decision. Richard looked up slowly. What kind of decision? Simple, the man replied. Control the situation before it controls us. Silence settled across the room. Then one executive slid a folder across the table. We prepared an acquisition proposal. Richard opened it slowly. $100 million. Immediate patent transfer. Full ownership rights. Non-compete restrictions. The room watched him carefully. You want me to buy her silence? Richard said flatly. We want you to protect this company, the executive answered. Because if her technology succeeds independently, Whitmore Steel loses billions. Richard closed the folder slowly. Somewhere across the city, Vivian was still working inside the same leaking garage where he once humiliated her publicly. Yet now the largest executives in Detroit were terrified of her. The irony sat bitterly in his chest. Before he could answer, the conference room doors suddenly opened. Ethan stepped inside unexpectedly. Every head turned immediately. You cannot do this, Ethan said firmly. Richard frowned slightly. This is a board meeting. Ethan ignored the comment completely. You buried her. Father's work once already. Now you want to bury hers too. Several executives shifted uncomfortably. One older board member snapped sharply. You have no authority here. Ethan looked directly at the room without backing down. Maybe not. But I know fear when I see it. Richard watched his son silently now. Ethan stepped closer toward the table. You are not afraid she is wrong, he said quietly. You are afraid she is right. The room fell silent again. Outside, thunder rolled faintly above downtown Detroit while rain streaked across the glass walls of the skyscraper. Richard slowly stood from his chair. Everyone leave us. Confused murmurs filled the room. But within moments the board members filed out reluctantly until only Richard and Ethan remained beneath the cold white lights of the enormous conference room. Ethan looked exhausted, angry, determined. Richard loosened his tie slowly. You helped her, he said quietly. Ethan did not deny it. Because somebody should have helped her father. The words landed harder than Richard expected. For several seconds neither man spoke. Finally Richard walked toward the window overlooking the city below. Somewhere beyond the rain and steel skyline, hidden among old factories and frozen streets, Vivian Cole was rebuilding an industry one engine at a time. Richard stared into the storm silently before asking the question that had begun haunting him every night. Do you think she will ever forgive this company? Ethan looked toward the dark skyline too. I do not think forgiveness is what motivates her anymore, he said softly. I think she just wants the world to finally see what her father already knew. 90 days after the night of the gala, snow covered downtown Detroit in a clean layer of white as black luxury cars lined the entrance to Whitmore Steel headquarters. Inside the building, tension moved through the executive floors like electricity. Reporters crowded behind velvet barriers outside, while financial networks broadcast live updates across the country. The emergency shareholder meeting had already become national news. Whitmore Steel stock had continued collapsing for weeks after 3 major freight companies announced pilot programs using Vivian Cole's fuel system. Investors were furious. Board members were desperate. And Richard Whitmore sat alone at the head of the enormous conference table watching the city through rain-streaked windows with the exhaustion of a man realizing power could disappear faster than he ever imagined. Across the room, executives whispered nervously while legal teams shuffled documents from one side of the table to the other. Nobody noticed the silence inside Richard himself. For the first time in his life, he understood what his father never did. Innovation did not care about status. Truth did not care about wealth. And humiliation had a strange way of returning to the people who created it. The elevator doors opened quietly at exactly 10:03 in the morning. Conversation stopped instantly. Vivian Cole stepped into the boardroom wearing a dark charcoal coat over a simple black dress, her hair pulled neatly back, her expression calm and unreadable. No apron, no grease stains, no tray in her hands, yet somehow she looked more powerful than anyone else in the room. Ethan walked beside her carrying a leather folder while reporters outside shouted questions from behind the glass lobby doors downstairs. Several board members stared openly in disbelief. One executive whispered under his breath, "How did she even get in here?" Then the lead attorney cleared his throat carefully. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, "representatives from Cole Thermal Industries have arrived." Silence crashed across the room. Richard slowly turned away from the window. For one brief second, neither of them spoke. The memory of the gala seemed to hang invisibly between them. The laughter, the humiliation, the challenge. 90 days. Vivian walked calmly toward the center of the room while the soft clicking of her heels echoed across polished marble floors. She placed a thin folder carefully onto the conference table. As of this morning, she said evenly, Cole Thermal Industries officially owns 51% controlling interest in Whitmore Steel. Several executives exploded into panic questions instantly. One board member stood so quickly. His chair nearly tipped backward. That is impossible. Vivian did not raise her voice. No, she replied calmly. It is public record. Ethan slid financial documents across the table while stunned attorneys began reviewing signatures and acquisition transfers with growing disbelief. During the chaos of the company collapse, private investors backing Vivian's technology had quietly purchased massive amounts of Whitmore Steel stock over the previous month. Nobody noticed until it was too late. Richard stared at the documents silently before finally looking up at her again. You bought the company. Vivian held his gaze steadily. No, she said softly. I saved it. The room fell quiet again. Outside, snow drifted slowly past the giant windows overlooking Detroit's frozen skyline. Vivian looked around the table at the frightened executives, who once would have ignored someone like her completely. I am not shutting down the factories, she continued. Nobody is losing their jobs. The workers did not create this mess. A few employees standing near the doorway looked visibly relieved. Vivian slowly turned toward Richard now. My father spent his life trying to build something that mattered inside these walls, she said quietly. And this company treated him like he was invisible. Richard lowered his eyes briefly. For the first time since inheriting Whitmore Steel, he had no defense left. Vivian reached into her folder and carefully removed one final document. An old engineering blueprint signed by Benjamin Cole more than 20 years earlier. She placed it gently on the conference table between them. His name goes back into the company archives today, she said. Richard stared at the blueprint silently while snow continued falling outside. Then slowly he nodded once. Not like a billionaire. Not like a man protecting pride. But like someone finally forced to face the truth. Later that afternoon, workers gathered outside the massive factory gates as crews removed the old Whitmore Steel sign from above the entrance. Cold wind swept through the crowd while giant steel bolts clanged against concrete. Vivian stood quietly beside Mr. Dawson and Ethan watching the new sign rise slowly into place beneath the gray Detroit sky. Cole Industries. For several seconds nobody spoke. Then Leonard Briggs removed his truck cap respectfully while workers around him began applauding softly one by one. Vivian looked toward the factory doors where her father had once walked carrying blueprints nobody believed in. Her eyes filled briefly, but she smiled anyway. Because sometimes the people the world laughs at are simply the ones brave enough to see the future first.